My MIL tried to force me to sign custody of my future baby boy over because I stole her son. Her meltdown was legendary when we revealed the gender. My mother-in-law Diane had this whole theory about how I stole her son from her. She'd tell anyone who would listen that before I came along, Trevor was the perfect son who called her every day and visited twice a week. Now he barely visits once a month because I'm holding him hostage with my manipulation. The first time she brought up her solution was at a family barbecue 3 months after our wedding. She pulled me aside while Trevor was helping his dad with the grill and said, "I've been thinking about how to make this fair. When you have a son, he'll be mine to raise. You took my boy, so you owe me another one." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking, but her face stayed completely serious. I already talked to my lawyer friend about grandparent rights. We can make it official. She kept bringing it up constantly after that. Every single family gathering, she'd mention her future grandson and how she was already planning his nursery in her house. She bought boy clothes and stored them in what she called his room. She'd introduce me to people as the woman who stole her son, but would make it right by giving her a grandson. Trevor thought his mom was just being weird and going through some phase. He'd tell her to stop, but then she'd cry about how I turned him against her and how she had nothing left to live for. So he'd back down and tell me to just ignore her, because she didn't really mean it. She absolutely meant it. Diane started sending me articles about pregnancy nutrition and prenatal vitamins. She signed me up for fertility clinic newsletters without asking. She'd loudly ask about my period at family dinners to track if I might be pregnant. When I said that was inappropriate, she said tracking her grandson's arrival was her right as the future primary caregiver. She actually created a contract on legal-looking paper that said I agreed to hand over my firstborn son to make up for taking hers. She brought it to Thanksgiving dinner and tried to make me sign it in front of everyone. When I refused, she started sobbing about how I was destroying her life twice, first by stealing Trevor and now by denying her a replacement son. Things escalated when she found out I was actually pregnant. Trevor had wanted to wait to tell people, but someone from my job saw us at the ultrasound place and word got back to Diane somehow. She showed up at our house at 10 at night with a minivan full of baby stuff, all of it blue. "I knew you were hiding my baby from me," she said, trying to push past me with an armload of boy clothes. When I told her we didn't know the gender yet, she said she had prayed for a boy, and God wouldn't betray her like we had. She started coming to all my doctor appointments without being invited. She'd just show up and tell the staff she was the primary guardian preparing to take custody. She told my actual doctor that I was just a surrogate carrying her son's baby for her. The medical staff had to call security twice because she kept insisting she had legal rights to be in the room. She joined pregnancy groups online pretending to be pregnant herself, posting about how her surrogate was being difficult, and asking for advice on getting custody of the baby immediately after birth. The climax came at my baby shower. She sent out invitations that said, "Celebrating Diane's new son," with no mention of me at all. The decorations were all pictures of Trevor as a baby with signs saying, "Getting my baby back," and "My second chance." She'd set up 2 gift tables, one labeled Diane's baby, and one labeled the surrogate. When guests arrived, she thanked them for supporting her journey to motherhood again. She kept referring to me as the vessel and herself as the real mother. She'd prepared this whole speech about how God gave her this opportunity to raise another son, after I selfishly took her first one. People were looking around completely confused and uncomfortable. Then she brought out her masterpiece, a massive poster board with her custody plan timeline. Week 1, baby moves in with her. Month 1, I'm allowed supervised visits. By year 1, the baby would call her mama and me by my first name. She'd actually laminated little cards for guests that explained the transfer process and how they should address her as the baby's mother going forward. That's when my sister-in-law Julia, who'd been recording everything on her phone for weeks because she thought no one would believe how crazy Diane was, finally had enough. Julia stood up and said, "Diane, since you love contracts and legal documents so much, let me read you something." She pulled out her phone and started reading from our state's grandparent rights law. Grandparents have no automatic rights to custody or visitation. They cannot take a child from fit parents. What you're describing is kidnapping. Julia kept going, reading case after case where grandparents tried to get custody and failed. She read the legal definition of harassment and stalking, pointing out how Diane following me to appointments and joining groups under false pretenses qualified. Then Julia said the thing that finally broke Diane. She pulled up a specific court case on her phone and started reading the judge's words about a grandmother who tried to claim custody rights over her daughter's baby. The judge had written that grandparents who harass parents, show up uninvited to medical appointments, and make threats about taking custody actually destroy any chance of having a relationship with the grandchild. Julia's voice got louder as she read how the judge called that grandmother's behavior dangerous and delusional. She looked straight at Diane while reading the part where the court said such behavior shows the grandparent is unfit to be around the child at all. Every single thing Julia read matched exactly what Diane had been doing to me for months. The baby shower guests sat frozen in their chairs watching Diane's face change colors. She went from angry red to this weird pale white like all the blood drained out of her head. Her mouth kept opening and closing, but no sound came out. Julia kept going, reading about harassment charges and restraining orders and how stalking pregnant women is a crime in our state. She read the definition of parental alienation and how courts view people who try to convince others they have custody rights they don't actually have. Then Julia said the thing that made Diane completely lose it. Julia lowered her phone and spoke directly to Diane in this calm, clear voice that somehow made everything she said hit harder. She told Diane that every single person in this room just witnessed her commit multiple acts that could result in criminal charges. She said all the videos on her phone showing Diane at my doctor's office claiming to be the primary guardian would be evidence of fraud and impersonation. Julia explained that the fake contract Diane brought to Thanksgiving dinner could be considered attempted coercion. She listed off everything Diane had done like she was reading charges in court. The baby shower guests looked absolutely shocked. Some of them had their phones out, and I realized they were recording too. Diane just stood there shaking, still holding those laminated cards about the custody transfer process. Trevor finally stood up from where he'd been sitting in the corner looking like he wanted to disappear. His hands were shaking, but his voice came out firm when he told his mother this ends right now. He said she needed to leave immediately. Diane started crying these big, loud sobs and reached for Trevor like she used to when he was little, and she wanted him to comfort her. But Trevor actually stepped back away from her. He repeated that she needed to go, and I could see his whole body trembling, but he didn't back down this time. Diane's crying turned into screaming so fast it made several guests jump. She yelled that we were all working together against her and trying to steal her grandson before he was even born. She grabbed that poster board with the custody timeline and shook it at everyone, screaming that this was a legal plan and we couldn't stop her. She said God promised her this baby to make up for me stealing Trevor. Julia stayed completely calm and pulled out her phone again. She called the police non-emergency line right there in front of everyone. I heard her explain to the operator that someone was refusing to leave a private event after being asked multiple times and was now causing a disturbance. Diane screamed louder when she realized Julia was actually calling the cops. She started saying we'd all regret this and that her lawyer would sue everyone in the room. The guests were gathering their things and moving toward the door, clearly uncomfortable and wanting to leave. Some of them stopped to squeeze my hand or whisper that they'd help if we needed anything. Margot came over and stood next to me like a bodyguard. We waited for the police, but they were taking a while because it wasn't an emergency call. Trevor's father showed up before the police did. Julia had texted him when Diane started screaming. He walked in and took one look at that custody timeline poster still in Diane's hands. He told her she'd completely lost her mind. His voice was tired, like he'd seen this kind of thing from her before. He said if she left quietly right now, he'd drive her home and we wouldn't press charges. Diane argued with him for almost 10 minutes. She kept insisting the baby was legally hers and that she had rights. Trevor's father finally raised his voice and told her the only right she had was to leave before the police arrived and arrested her. Something about the way he said it must have gotten through because Diane finally stopped screaming. She gathered up all her blue baby clothes and that poster board. She looked at me with this expression that was half hatred and half desperation. Then she looked at Trevor and started crying again, saying he used to love her before I ruined everything. Trevor's father took her arm and guided her toward the door. She left still crying and muttering about her grandson and how unfair this all was. The second the door closed behind them, I completely fell apart. All the fear and stress from the past 3 months hit me at once. I started sobbing so hard I couldn't catch my breath. Trevor wrapped his arms around me and kept saying he was sorry over and over. He said he should have taken this seriously from the start instead of telling me to ignore his mom. He admitted he kept hoping she'd snap out of it on her own because he didn't want to deal with the conflict. I couldn't even respond because I was crying too hard and shaking. Margot brought me water and helped me sit down. The remaining guests were all hovering around looking concerned and upset. Trevor held me while I cried and kept apologizing. He said he'd been scared of losing his mom completely if he stood up to her. He said he knew that was stupid now because protecting our family had to come first. I could feel him shaking too. His mom had manipulated him his whole life with tears and guilt trips, and he'd finally broken free of it. It felt like something huge had shifted between us, even though the situation was terrible. The baby shower guests who were still there came over one by one. They told us they were so sorry we'd been dealing with this. Several people offered to write statements about what they witnessed if we needed them for legal reasons. One woman said she had photos of the poster board and the 2 gift tables labeled for Diane's baby and the surrogate. Another guest said she'd recorded part of Diane's speech about being the real mother. Everyone was being so supportive and kind. They helped gather up the gifts and take down Diane's creepy decorations. Someone found the laminated cards Diane had made and showed them to everyone. The cards actually had instructions for guests about addressing Diane as the baby's mother and referring to me by my first name only. It was disturbing to see it all written out like that. Margot stayed after everyone else left. She helped me clean up and kept checking to make sure I was okay. We threw away all of Diane's decorations and the custody timeline poster. Margot asked if I wanted her to stay the night, but I said Trevor and I needed to talk. She hugged me for a long time before leaving. That night, Trevor and I had the most honest conversation we'd ever had about his mother. We sat on the couch for hours talking about her behavior and his role in letting it continue. Trevor admitted he'd been making excuses for his mom his whole life. He said she'd always been controlling and manipulative, but he learned early to just give in because fighting her was exhausting. He told me about times when he was younger when she'd threatened to hurt herself if he didn't do what she wanted. He said he'd been terrified of being responsible for his mom's death or mental breakdown, so he'd just kept appeasing her and telling himself she didn't really mean the extreme things she said. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said he'd put that pattern onto our situation with the baby. He'd convinced himself she was just excited and would calm down eventually. He said watching her tonight made him realize she was never going to stop on her own. She actually believed the baby was hers, and that she had legal rights to take custody. Trevor said he was scared of what she might try to do after the baby was born. We talked about getting legal protection and making sure the hospital knew not to let her anywhere near us. I told him I was scared too, but also relieved that he finally saw how serious this was. The next morning, we met with Dominic Taylor at his law office. Julia had recommended him because he specialized in family law and restraining orders. Dominic was maybe 40 with gray starting in his hair, and this calm way of talking that made me feel less panicked. We showed him all of Julia's videos from the past few weeks. He watched Diane at the baby shower presenting her custody timeline and calling me the surrogate. He looked at photos of the poster board and the laminated cards. We told him about her showing up at my doctor appointments and telling the medical staff she was the primary guardian. We explained how she'd been doing this for 3 months and it kept getting worse. Dominic took notes while we talked and asked specific questions about dates and times. He said we had really strong grounds for a restraining order based on the harassment pattern. He explained that what Diane was doing met the legal definition of stalking in our state. The videos showing her at medical appointments claiming false authority could actually be fraud charges if we wanted to pursue that. Dominic said judges take this kind of behavior very seriously, especially when it involves a pregnant woman and an unborn child. Dominic pulled up the grandparent rights law for our state on his computer. He explained that while grandparent rights do exist, they only apply in very specific situations. If parents are married and living together, and both are fit parents, then grandparents have basically no legal standing to demand custody or even visitation. The only times courts grant grandparent rights are when parents are divorced, or one parent has died, or there's proof of abuse or neglect. He said even in those cases, the grandparent has to prove they had an established relationship with the child, and that losing contact would harm the child. Diane had zero legal standing to demand custody of our baby. In fact, her behavior over the past 3 months actually worked against her ever having any kind of access to our child. Dominic said if we ever did decide to let her meet the baby someday, a judge would likely order supervised visits only based on her documented harassment and delusions. He told us the fake contract she tried to make me sign had no legal validity whatsoever. Grandparents can't contract for custody of children who aren't born yet and who have fit parents. The whole thing was completely made up in Diane's head, but she'd convinced herself it was real. We talked about our options for protecting ourselves. Dominic said we could file for a restraining order right away based on everything that had happened, but he suggested we might want to try sending a formal cease and desist letter first. The letter would be from his law office on official letterhead. It would clearly state that Diane must stop all contact with me immediately. She couldn't call, text, email, or show up at our home or my workplace or my medical appointments. She couldn't post about me or our baby on social media or in online groups. The letter would explain that her behavior constitutes harassment and stalking under state law. It would warn that if she violated any of these terms, we would immediately file for a restraining order and possibly press criminal charges. Dominic said sometimes people respond better to an official legal letter than they do to family members asking them to stop. The letter would make it crystal clear that her behavior was illegal and had to end. If she ignored the letter or violated any of the terms, then we'd have even stronger evidence for the restraining order. Trevor and I talked it over and decided to try the cease and desist letter first. We wanted to give Diane one chance to stop voluntarily before we got the courts involved. Dominic said he'd draft the letter that day and have it sent by certified mail so we'd have proof she received it. The letter arrived at Diane's house 2 days later according to the tracking number. Trevor and I tried to go about our normal routine while waiting to see if she would actually listen to the lawyer's warning. 3 nights after the letter was delivered, I woke up at midnight to the sound of someone pounding on our front door so hard I thought the wood might crack. I grabbed my phone and saw it was exactly 12:03 in the morning. The pounding got louder and then I heard Diane screaming from outside about how we couldn't keep her grandson from her and she had rights. Trevor jumped out of bed and told me to stay in the bedroom while he went to see what was happening. I could hear Diane yelling that she knew we were in there and she wasn't leaving until we gave her back her baby. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold my phone. Trevor came back to the bedroom and said he was calling the police because his mom was completely out of control and he was worried she might break a window or hurt herself. I sat on the floor of our bedroom with my back against the bed, listening to Diane scream and bang on the door while Trevor talked to the emergency operator. He had to give our address twice because his voice was shaking. The operator said police were on their way and to stay inside and not open the door. Diane kept yelling about how I was a thief and a liar and how God told her the baby was meant to be hers. She started kicking the door, and I heard something that sounded like she was trying to break the lock. Trevor sat down next to me on the floor and put his arm around me. We could hear sirens getting closer, and then suddenly Diane stopped making noise. By the time the police knocked and identified themselves, everything had gone quiet except for the sound of someone crying on our front porch. Trevor opened the door for the 2 officers who had responded to the call. They asked if we were okay, and then went to talk to Diane, who was sitting on our porch steps sobbing. I stayed inside, but I could hear one of the officers explaining to her that she needed to leave immediately, or she would be arrested for trespassing. Diane told them we were keeping her baby hostage inside the house. The officer asked her to clarify what she meant, and she said her grandson was in there and we wouldn't let her see him. The other officer asked how old the child was, and Diane said he wasn't born yet, but he was hers. Both officers looked confused and came back to talk to Trevor. They asked him to explain the situation, and he told them about the cease and desist letter and how his mother had been harassing me throughout my pregnancy. He showed them the letter from Dominic on his phone. The officers went back to Diane and spent almost 10 minutes trying to explain that an unborn baby legally belongs to its parents, and she had no right to demand access. Diane kept insisting they didn't understand, and she had talked to a lawyer about grandparent rights. One officer finally told her that she needed to go home right now, and if she came back, she would be arrested. They offered to drive her, but she said she had her car. The officers watched her get in her car and followed her for a few blocks to make sure she actually left. They came back to give us an incident report number and suggested we file for a restraining order in the morning. I barely slept the rest of that night. Every sound made me think Diane was coming back. Trevor and I were at the courthouse when it opened at 8 in the morning. We filled out all the paperwork for an emergency restraining order and attached copies of everything we had, including the cease and desist letter, the incident report from last night, and photos from the baby shower. The clerk said a judge would review it that day, and we should get a call about whether it was approved. We went home and I tried to eat something, but I felt sick. My phone rang at 2 in the afternoon, and it was the courthouse saying the judge had granted a temporary restraining order. Diane was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of us or our home. The order was good for 2 weeks until we could have a full hearing where a judge would decide whether to make it permanent. The clerk said the sheriff's department would serve Diane with the order that day, so she would know about it officially. I felt like I could finally breathe a little bit. Trevor looked relieved but also sad. I knew this was hard for him, even though it was necessary. That evening, Trevor's father called his cell phone. Trevor put it on speaker so I could hear. His dad said he heard about what happened last night and he wanted to apologize for Diane's behavior. He said he should have warned us sooner about how she could get when she became focused on something. Then he told us something I didn't know. He said he divorced Diane 15 years ago, and one of the main reasons was because of her controlling behavior and the way she would become obsessed with things. He said over the years since the divorce he had watched her get worse, and the situation with the baby had pushed her completely over the edge. Trevor asked why he never said anything before, and his dad said he hoped she would stay stable, and he didn't want to interfere in Trevor's relationship with his mother. But now he could see that staying quiet had been a mistake. He said if we needed him to testify at the restraining order hearing, he would do it. He would tell the judge everything he had seen over the years. Trevor thanked him and said we would let him know. After the call ended, Trevor just sat there staring at his phone. I asked if he was okay, and he said he didn't know. He said his whole life he thought his parents' divorce was because they grew apart, but now he was learning it was because his mom had serious problems. The next day, I called a therapist named Kylie Armstrong that Julia had recommended. Kylie specialized in family boundary issues and pregnancy stress. I got an appointment for 2 days later. When I went to see her, I explained everything that had been happening with Diane. Kylie listened and took notes, and then she said something that made me feel so much better. She said my fear was completely reasonable given what I had been dealing with. She said sometimes people try to tell themselves they're overreacting, but in my case, I was actually underreacting if anything. A woman who believed she had the right to take my baby and who showed up at my house at midnight screaming was absolutely someone I should be afraid of. Kylie taught me some strategies for managing my anxiety when I felt it getting too high. She also said the stress I was under could affect my blood pressure and the baby, so it was important I had support. We made a plan to meet once a week until after the baby was born. Having someone validate that I wasn't crazy for being scared helped more than I expected. Meanwhile, Julia was putting together a complete record of everything Diane had done. She went through all the videos she had taken on her phone over the past few weeks and created a timeline with dates and descriptions. She wrote down every incident she had personally witnessed going back months. And then she reached out to 3 other family members who had seen Diane's behavior and asked them to write statements. Trevor's aunt wrote about the Thanksgiving dinner where Diane tried to make me sign the fake contract. A cousin wrote about a family barbecue where Diane told everyone I was just a surrogate. Another relative wrote about how Diane had called her asking for advice about getting custody and seemed to genuinely believe it was possible. Julia compiled everything into a folder organized by date, with printouts of the videos and all the written statements. She brought it to our house and showed us what she had put together. It was actually shocking to see it all laid out like that. The pattern of behavior was so clear when you looked at it all together. 2 days before the restraining order hearing was scheduled, I started getting emails from Diane. The first one came from an email address I didn't recognize. It said, "Please reconsider and let me be part of my grandson's life." Then another email came from a different address saying she was sorry for scaring me, but she just loved the baby so much. Then another one came that said if I didn't stop this legal action, she would have no choice but to sue for grandparent rights. Over the next 6 hours, I got 23 emails from different accounts. Some of them were begging and apologizing. Others were angry and threatening. One said she had already talked to 3 different lawyers about her case. Another said she was the baby's real mother, and I was just carrying him for her. I forwarded every single email to Dominic as they came in. He said this was actually good for our case because it showed Diane couldn't control herself even with a temporary restraining order in place. He forwarded everything to the police and they added it to the file. Diane was creating more evidence of her inability to respect any boundaries. The restraining order hearing was in a small courtroom with just us, Diane, the judge, and a court clerk. Dominic presented all our evidence, including Julia's videos, the photos from the baby shower with the custody timeline poster, and the police report from the midnight visit. The judge watched the videos on a laptop, and you could see his expression getting more serious as he went through everything. Diane tried to interrupt and say she was just an excited grandmother being kept from her grandson. The judge held up his hand and told her to wait her turn. When Dominic finished presenting everything, the judge asked Diane if she wanted to respond. She stood up and started talking about how she had raised Trevor by herself after the divorce, and now I had stolen him from her. She said all she wanted was a chance to be a grandmother, and we were being cruel by keeping her away. The judge stopped her and said this wasn't about normal grandparent access. He said the evidence showed harassment and stalking behavior, not grandmotherly excitement. He said showing up at someone's house at midnight screaming was not appropriate under any circumstances. The judge said he was granting a restraining order for 1 year. Diane was not allowed to contact either of us directly or indirectly. She couldn't come to our home or our workplaces. She couldn't post about us or our baby on social media. She couldn't send emails or letters or have anyone else contact us on her behalf. If she violated any part of the order, she would be arrested immediately. Diane started crying and said this wasn't fair. The judge said he understood this was difficult, but her behavior had left him no choice. He said if she could demonstrate over the next year that she could respect boundaries, then we might consider supervised visits in the future, but that was entirely up to us. He warned her that if she violated this order even once, she would face criminal charges. The clerk gave us both copies of the order and we left the courtroom. I felt this huge sense of relief that someone in authority had finally told Diane no in a way she couldn't ignore. We walked out to the parking lot and got in the car. Trevor sat in the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. He just put his head down on the steering wheel and started crying. I had never seen him cry like that before. His whole body was shaking. I put my hand on his back and waited. After a few minutes, he said he felt like he was losing his mom. I told him his mom had made choices that led to this, and we were just protecting ourselves. He said he knew that, but it still hurt. He said his whole life he thought his mom loved him, and now he was realizing she had been controlling and manipulative the whole time. He said he felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault, and that recognizing the truth now was what mattered. We sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes while Trevor cried and I held him. Finally, he said we should go home. He said this was painful but necessary, and he knew we were doing the right thing for our family. I said we would get through this together. He started the car and we drove home knowing we finally had legal protection, but also knowing the cost of getting it had been high. The next few days felt strange, like we were living in this bubble where we could finally breathe, but also waiting for something else to happen. Trevor went back to work, and I tried to focus on the pregnancy instead of constantly looking over my shoulder. We talked one night about whether we wanted to find out the baby's gender, and Trevor said he was ready if I was. I realized I wanted to know, wanted to celebrate this baby without Diane's fantasy hanging over everything. We called Margot and asked if we could do a small gender reveal at her place the following weekend, just our closest people who had supported us through all of this. She got excited and said she would make a cake and we could keep it simple and happy. We invited Julia and her family, Trevor's father, and a few of our friends who knew what we had been dealing with. The morning of the party, my doctor's office called with the results, and I gave them to Margot, so she could make the cake the right color. Trevor and I spent the day trying not to think about what the answer would be, just focusing on the fact that we got to find out together without anyone trying to take over the moment. We arrived at Margot's house around 2 in the afternoon, and everyone was already there. The living room decorated with simple yellow and white balloons, since we hadn't told anyone the gender yet. Margot brought out this beautiful cake covered in white frosting with question marks piped on top, and everyone gathered around with their phones ready to record. Trevor and I held the knife together and cut into the cake, and when we pulled the slice out, the inside was bright pink. Everyone started cheering and hugging us, and Julia was crying happy tears while her kids jumped around excited about having a cousin. Trevor pulled me close and whispered that he was so happy, and I felt this weird mix of pure joy about our daughter, and also this massive relief that Diane's whole fantasy was based on something that wasn't even real. She had spent months planning to take custody of a grandson who didn't exist. Julia came over while we were eating cake and said Diane was probably going to lose her mind when she found out it was a girl, since her entire custody plan was specifically about replacing Trevor with a grandson. We all laughed, but I felt anxious too, wondering how Diane would react when she eventually learned the truth. Trevor's father was quiet for a bit. Then he pulled Trevor aside and asked if he could share the news with Diane. He said maybe knowing it was a girl would help her accept reality and move on from this obsession. Trevor looked at me, and I didn't know what to say. So we told his father we needed to check with Dominic first to make sure it wouldn't violate the restraining order. We called Dominic that evening and explained the situation, and he said technically it wouldn't be a violation if Trevor's father chose to tell Diane information he learned on his own. He warned us that Diane might still try to contact us about it, and if she did, we should document everything and report it immediately. Trevor's father said he would tell her the next day and let us know how it went. 3 days later, he called Trevor and said he had shown Diane a photo from the gender reveal that Julia sent him. At first, Diane refused to believe him and insisted he was lying to protect us. When he showed her the photo of us cutting into the pink cake, she had a complete meltdown. She threw her phone across the room and started screaming that we had known all along and deliberately led her on just to hurt her. Trevor's father said he had never seen her that angry, that she was convinced we had somehow paid off the ultrasound technician to lie about the gender just to humiliate her. He said she ranted for over an hour about how we were evil and cruel, and she would find a way to prove we were lying. The next morning, I woke up to 17 new emails from an account I didn't recognize. They were all from Diane, sent between 2 and 5 in the morning, and they were completely unhinged. She wrote that she knew we had always known it was a girl, and we strung her along on purpose. She said we probably paid the doctor to fake the ultrasound results just to torture her. She claimed we were going to pay for what we did to her, that karma would come for us, that God saw what we were doing. The emails got more and more disconnected from reality as they went on, talking about how we stole her son, and now we were stealing her chance at redemption. I forwarded all of them to Dominic, and he said to send them to the police right away as restraining order violations. We drove to the police station and showed an officer everything, and he said he would go to Diane's house that day to give her a formal warning. He said one more contact attempt and she would be arrested immediately. Trevor's father called that afternoon and said the police had been there, and Diane was scared enough that she finally seemed to understand she had to stop. He said she deleted all her email accounts and promised she wouldn't try to reach us again. The officer called us later to confirm the warning was delivered and Diane understood the consequences. After that, Diane went completely silent. No emails, no calls, no showing up anywhere. Trevor's father said she barely left her house for a week, just stayed inside and didn't talk to anyone. The silence was almost as weird as the harassment had been, like we kept waiting for the next thing to happen. But weeks went by and nothing did. I could go to my doctor appointments without checking the waiting room for her face. I could go to the grocery store without worrying she would corner me in an aisle. The last 2 months of my pregnancy were peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced since before Diane found out I was expecting. Trevor and I took a childbirth class at the hospital on Tuesday evenings, learning breathing techniques and labor positions. The other couples in the class would talk about their families and who was coming to visit after the baby arrived, and we would just smile and not mention that we had a restraining order against Trevor's mother. I kept seeing Kylie every other week, and we worked on strategies for protecting our boundaries after the baby came. She helped us create a clear plan for who could visit and when, what information we would share on social media, how we would handle anyone who tried to push our limits. Trevor practiced saying no without explaining or justifying, just a simple no that didn't leave room for argument. We decided together that we wanted to keep the baby's birth completely private from extended family until we were ready to share the news ourselves. We didn't want anyone showing up at the hospital or posting about it online before we had time to adjust to being parents. We told Margot and Julia they were the only ones who would know when I went into labor, and they would help us manage communication with everyone else. Margot said she would bring us food and supplies but wouldn't overstay her welcome, and Julia promised to run interference if anyone started asking questions. We felt ready, or as ready as anyone can feel before their first baby arrives. The nursery was finished with soft yellow walls and white furniture, clothes washed and folded in the dresser, car seat installed and inspected. We had done this without Diane trying to take over every decision, without her showing up with blue outfits and custody demands. Our daughter would come home to a peaceful house with parents who knew how to protect her, and that felt like the best gift we could give her. I woke up at 2 a.m, 3 days before my due date with my water breaking all over our bed. Trevor jumped up and started grabbing the hospital bag we'd packed weeks ago, while I called Margot to let her know it was happening. The contractions started getting stronger during the 20-minute drive to the hospital, and Trevor kept one hand on the wheel and one hand holding mine while he called Margot again to activate our communication plan. When we got to the maternity ward, the nurse checked my file and I saw her make a note on her computer before she picked up the phone. She told someone that the patient with the security alert had arrived and they needed someone at the desk right away. A security guard showed up within 5 minutes, and the nurse explained to us that they'd flagged Diane's name and description in the system, so if anyone matching her information tried to get up to our floor, security would stop them before they reached the maternity ward. The next 12 hours were the hardest physical thing I'd ever done, but Trevor stayed right next to me the whole time, letting me squeeze his hand until I thought I might break his fingers. When Kendall finally arrived at 2 p.m, tiny and perfect and screaming, the nurse put her on my chest and I couldn't stop crying. Trevor was crying too when he got to hold her for the first time, just staring at her face like he couldn't believe she was real. We spent those first few hours just being together as our new family of 3, taking a million photos on our phones but not sending them to anyone yet. The nurses kept the door closed and only came in when necessary, giving us privacy to just be with our daughter without the world knowing she'd arrived yet. On day 2 in the hospital, a nurse came in during her morning rounds and mentioned something while checking my blood pressure. She said someone had called the main hospital line earlier asking about patients matching our description, but hospital policy didn't let them confirm any patient information to anyone not on our approved visitor list. The nurse said the caller had been a woman who sounded older and kept insisting she was the grandmother and had rights to know if her grandson had been born. We looked at each other and knew immediately it was Diane, but she never actually showed up at the hospital in person. The security guard told us later that they'd been watching for her specifically, and she must have realized the restraining order meant she'd be arrested if she tried to come inside. That night, I finally relaxed enough to sleep for more than an hour at a time, knowing that Diane couldn't get to us or Kendall no matter how hard she tried. We brought Kendall home after 2 days when the doctor cleared us to leave. Margot had already been to our house that morning to make sure everything was ready and check that there were no signs anyone had been around our property. She'd put fresh sheets on our bed and stocked the fridge with easy meals and left a note on the counter welcoming us home. The next few weeks were completely exhausting in ways I hadn't imagined, learning how to change diapers and figure out why Kendall was crying and function on 2 hours of sleep at a time. But it was also kind of magical because we got to do it without anyone showing up uninvited or criticizing our choices or trying to take over. Trevor's confidence as a dad grew every day as he learned to calm Kendall down when she was fussy and give her bottles when I needed to sleep. We took walks around the neighborhood with Kendall in her stroller and went to her pediatrician appointments without worrying that someone would be waiting in the parking lot. It felt like what becoming parents were supposed to feel like, just us figuring things out together without constant interference. 3 weeks after Kendall was born, Trevor's father sent a text asking if he could meet his granddaughter. We talked about it for a few days and then discussed it with both Kylie and Dominic to make sure we were making a safe choice. They both said that supervised visits with clear boundaries were reasonable, as long as we felt comfortable, and Trevor's father had proven over the past months that he could respect our limits. We agreed to have him come to our house on a Saturday afternoon with the understanding that the visit would be short, and he couldn't take any photos to share with Diane. When he arrived, he brought a simple gift, a soft stuffed bunny, and asked permission before picking Kendall up. He held his granddaughter gently for about 20 minutes, talking to her softly, and not asking us invasive questions about our parenting, or making demands about future visits. When Kendall started getting fussy, he handed her back to me right away, and thanked us for letting him meet her before leaving exactly when we'd agreed the visit would end. Trevor seemed relieved after his dad left, like maybe it was possible to have some family relationships that worked even after everything with Diane. We waited until Kendall was 6 weeks old before sharing her birth announcement on social media with strict privacy settings that only let our approved friends see the post. The announcement included one photo of Kendall sleeping in her bassinet, and a clear statement that we'd be sharing photos and updates on our own timeline, and we asked everyone to respect our privacy by not sharing our posts elsewhere. Within an hour, several family members commented with congratulations and genuine happiness, and everyone seemed to understand and respect our boundaries about keeping things private. My parents commented that they couldn't wait to meet her when we were ready, and Julia wrote that Kendall was beautiful, and she was proud of us for protecting our family. It felt good to share our joy with people who actually cared about us, and not just about getting access to our baby. 2 weeks after we posted the announcement, Trevor's father called to say that a letter had arrived at his house addressed to both of us. He offered to open it and read it to us over the phone, and when we agreed, he said it was from Diane. The letter was surprisingly calm compared to everything before, just congratulating us on Kendall's arrival and saying she understood why we'd set the boundaries we had. She wrote that she wanted to work toward eventually meeting Kendall under whatever conditions we decided were appropriate, and she knew she needed to prove she could respect our choices as parents. There were no demands or guilt trips or threats about grandparent rights. Just a simple request to consider letting her be part of Kendall's life someday, if she could show us she'd changed. We told Trevor's father we needed time to think about it and asked him to hold on to the letter for now. That night, after Kendall went to sleep, Trevor and I sat at the kitchen table trying to figure out if Diane's letter meant genuine change, or if it was just a new way to manipulate us. We called Dominic the next day and then had a video session with Kylie to talk through what the letter might mean. Kylie said that sometimes people do actually change when they face real consequences and lose something important to them, and the restraining order plus the reality that Kendall was a girl instead of the grandson Diane had obsessed over might have finally forced her to accept things. But Kylie also warned us that change takes sustained effort over time, not just one nice letter, and we shouldn't make any decisions based on words alone. Dominic agreed and said that if we wanted to leave the door open for future contact, we should make it conditional on Diane doing actual therapeutic work and proving through consistent behavior that she understood why what she'd done was wrong. After talking it over for another week and discussing it again with both Kylie and Dominic, we decided to send a response through Dominic's office so it would be official and documented. The letter stated that we were willing to consider supervised contact in the future if Diane completed therapy with a licensed professional and demonstrated consistent respect for our boundaries over a period of at least 6 months. We made it really clear that this wasn't a promise or a set timeline, just a possibility if she did the actual work to change her behavior and thinking patterns. We also said that any future contact would be entirely on our terms and schedule, and we reserved the right to end contact again if she violated boundaries or made us uncomfortable. Dominic sent the letter to Trevor's father's address with instructions to give it to Diane, and then we waited to see what would happen next. 3 weeks later, Trevor's father called to report that Diane had enrolled in therapy and had been attending weekly sessions with a therapist who specialized in family relationships and boundary issues. He said she'd given him permission to confirm her attendance with us, and that she seemed to be genuinely working on understanding why her behavior had been harmful and scary. According to him, Diane had even talked in one of their recent conversations about how she'd been so focused on her own pain about losing Trevor that she couldn't see how she was hurting us and putting Kendall at risk. We told Trevor's father we appreciated the update, but we were going to stay cautious and see if Diane could maintain this progress over time before we made any decisions about contact. Trevor seemed both hopeful and skeptical after the call, wanting to believe his mom could actually change, but also protecting himself from disappointment if this turned out to be temporary. Kendall turned 3 months old on a Tuesday, and I spent the morning watching her discover her hands like they were the most amazing things in the world. She'd hold them up in front of her face and stare at them for minutes at a time, opening and closing her tiny fingers. Trevor came home from work early just to hang out with us, and we laid on a blanket on the living room floor, while Kendall kicked her legs and made happy noises. The best part was that I didn't spend the whole time looking over my shoulder or checking my phone for crazy messages from Diane. We could just be parents without all the fear and stress that had taken over my entire pregnancy. My body had recovered from the birth better than I expected, and the doctor said everything looked good at my last checkup. But the bigger recovery was mental, not having to deal with Diane's constant harassment and threats. I could actually enjoy being a mom instead of feeling like I had to protect Kendall from someone who wanted to steal her. Trevor started going to therapy around the same time, meeting with a counselor twice a week to work through everything with his mother. He'd come home from sessions looking tired but also lighter somehow, like he was finally putting down weight he'd been carrying for years. One night after Kendall went to sleep, he told me his therapist had helped him see how he'd been making excuses for Diane's behavior since he was a kid. Anytime she did something controlling or manipulative, he'd convince himself it was because she loved him so much or she was just worried. His therapist called it enabling, and Trevor was learning to recognize when he fell into those old patterns. He practiced setting boundaries in therapy, role-playing conversations where he stood firm instead of backing down when Diane cried or guilt-tripped him. I could see the difference in how he talked about his mom now. He still felt sad about the whole situation, but he wasn't making excuses for what she'd done, or suggesting we should just give her another chance without real proof of change. We celebrated Kendall's 3-month milestone with a small gathering at our house on Saturday afternoon. Margot brought a chocolate cake she'd made, and Julia came with her kids who were fascinated by how tiny Kendall was. Trevor's father showed up right on time with a wrapped present under his arm. He asked if it was okay to take a few photos before he even pulled out his phone, and he sent them just to Trevor instead of posting them anywhere online. While Kendall napped in her bassinet, Trevor's father mentioned that Diane had asked about her a few times, but in a normal way, just wondering how she was doing. He said Diane hadn't made any demands about wanting to see Kendall or complained about being kept away. She'd even stopped bringing up the whole grandson fantasy, and seemed to accept that Kendall was a girl, and that we were her parents. It felt like progress, even though we all knew it was still early and Diane could backslide at any point. The restraining order was set to expire in 9 months, and Trevor and I had been talking about whether we should renew it or let it lapse. We scheduled a meeting with Dominic at his office to get his legal opinion on the best approach. He pulled out the file with all the documentation from the original hearing and reminded us how serious Diane's behavior had been. Then he said that the point of a restraining order wasn't punishment, it was protection, and we needed to decide if we still needed that level of legal protection. Dominic explained that we could always file a new restraining order if Diane started up again, but letting this one expire might give her incentive to keep behaving appropriately. He suggested we make it clear through Trevor's father that any future contact would depend entirely on Diane respecting our boundaries, and that we'd go right back to court if she violated our trust. We left his office feeling like we had options instead of being locked into one path, which made the whole situation feel more manageable. When Kendall was 4 months old, I went back to work part-time, just 3 days a week to start. My boss had been really understanding about everything that happened during my pregnancy, and she'd kept my position open even though I'd taken more time off than originally planned. It felt good to put on work clothes and have conversations about projects and deadlines instead of diapers and feeding schedules. I loved being Kendall's mom, but I also needed to be myself sometimes, and work gave me that space. Trevor and I had worked out a childcare routine where his father watched Kendall 1 day a week. Margot took her another day, and we used a daycare near my office for the 3rd day. It took some adjusting to get the timing right and figure out all the logistics of bottles and backup clothes and nap schedules. But we got into a rhythm pretty quickly, and I was surprised by how much Trevor and I had grown as both individuals and as a team through everything we'd been through with Diane. Julia stopped by one afternoon with her 2 kids, and we sat in the backyard while the older ones played on Kendall's baby gym. Julia watched Kendall grab at the hanging toys and said she couldn't believe Diane had been so obsessed with taking custody of a baby to raise. She joked that Diane clearly had no memory of how exhausting actual parenting was, especially with a newborn who woke up every few hours. We pulled up photos on Julia's phone of that baby shower with the custody timeline poster, and we laughed at how completely insane the whole thing looked now. The laminated cards explaining the transfer process, the 2 gift tables, the signs about getting her baby back. Julia said she still had all the videos saved in 3 different places in case we ever needed them for legal purposes. We talked about how the situation hadn't been funny at all when we were living through it, how scared I'd been that Diane might actually try to take Kendall from the hospital or show up at our house in the middle of the night. But now, with some distance and safety, we could see how disconnected from reality Diane's whole fantasy had been. 6 months after Kendall was born, Trevor's father called to give us an update on Diane. He said she'd been going to therapy consistently for the whole 6 months without missing a single appointment. Her therapist had apparently helped her understand that her behavior toward us had been harmful and scary, not just enthusiastic grandparenting. Trevor's father also mentioned that Diane had started volunteering at a community center 3 days a week, helping with their meal program for seniors. It sounded like she was finding purpose and structure outside of obsessing over our family, which was exactly what she needed. We told Trevor's father we were glad Diane was doing better and making positive changes. But we also made it really clear that any future contact would depend entirely on her continuing that good behavior and respecting whatever boundaries we set. We weren't going to rush into anything just because she'd had a few good months. We took Kendall to visit my parents for a long weekend when she was 7 months old, and it was such a relief to be around family who acted normal. My mom held Kendall and cooed at her, then handed her right back when Kendall started fussing for me. My dad asked if it was okay to post one photo on his private social media before he shared anything. They asked questions about our parenting choices in a genuinely curious way, not like they were judging us or thought they knew better. This was how grandparenting was supposed to work, with respect and boundaries and trust. My mom made meals and did our laundry without being asked, but she didn't try to take over or act like we didn't know what we were doing. When we left on Sunday, my dad hugged us both and said he was proud of how we'd handled everything with Diane and protected our family. As Kendall got closer to 8 months old, Trevor and I started talking about whether we wanted more kids eventually. We'd both always thought we wanted at least 2 children, but the whole situation with Diane had made us question everything. One night after putting Kendall to bed, we sat on the couch and talked through all our concerns and hopes. Trevor said he felt confident now that we could protect our family boundaries no matter what happened with his mother. I agreed, and I realized the experience had taught us that we were stronger than we'd thought. Our marriage had survived serious external pressure, and we'd learned how to stand together even when it was hard. We decided we'd probably try for another baby in a year or so, once Kendall was a bit older, and we felt more settled into parenting. Trevor's father called a few weeks later to ask if Diane could send Kendall a birthday card for her first birthday, which was still 4 months away. We talked it over and decided a card would be acceptable as long as it didn't include any guilt trips or requests to see Kendall. Trevor's father understood and said he'd make sure Diane knew the rules. When the card arrived in early November, we had Dominic look at it before we even opened it, just to be safe. He read through it carefully and said it was actually appropriate. Just warm wishes for Kendall's birthday and a savings bond for $50. No manipulation, no demands, no passive-aggressive comments about being kept away. It was the kind of card a normal grandmother might send, and that felt like real progress, even though we stayed cautious about what it meant for the future. 2 months before the restraining order was set to expire, Trevor and I sat at our kitchen table with all the documentation Dominic had helped us compile over the past year. We had copies of every appropriate text Diane had sent through Trevor's father, records of the therapy attendance his father reported, and notes from Dominic about what factors to consider when deciding whether to renew. Trevor spread the papers across the table and we went through each one, talking about whether we felt safe enough to let the legal protection lapse. The decision felt huge because renewing meant another year of court involvement and fees, but not renewing meant trusting that Diane had actually changed enough to respect boundaries without a judge forcing her to. We talked for almost 3 hours that night, going back and forth about what felt right. I kept thinking about how peaceful the last several months had been without her constant interference, and whether that peace would last if we removed the legal barrier. Trevor pointed out that we could always file for a new restraining order if she started up again, and that keeping all our documentation meant we had proof of the pattern if we ever needed it. We finally decided that we'd let it expire but stay very alert to any signs that Diane was slipping back into old behaviors. The decision made my stomach tight with anxiety, but it also felt like the right step if we were ever going to have any kind of functional relationship with her. We called Dominic the next day to tell him our choice, and he said it was reasonable given the sustained period of appropriate behavior, but he emphasized that we should document everything going forward just in case. Planning Kendall's first birthday party gave us something positive to focus on instead of worrying about the restraining order situation. We decided to keep it small with just close friends and family at our house, nothing fancy or stressful. I spent the week before baking a smash cake for Kendall and a regular cake for everyone else, and Trevor hung streamers in our living room that Kendall kept trying to pull down during her naps. The morning of the party, I dressed Kendall in a little yellow dress that my mom had sent, and she looked so grown up compared to the tiny baby we'd brought home a year ago. Margot arrived first with a huge stuffed giraffe that was almost as tall as Kendall, and Julia came right after, with her kids who were excited to play with the birthday girl. Trevor's father showed up exactly on time carrying a wrapped present and a gift bag, and when Trevor opened the door for him, I could see how nervous his father looked about whether this was okay. Trevor hugged him and thanked him for coming, and his father's whole body relaxed. During the party, Trevor's father sat on our couch and held Kendall when she got tired of all the attention, and he was so gentle with her that I felt glad we'd included him. When it was time for presents, he handed us the wrapped box first, and inside were a dozen framed photos of Trevor as a baby and toddler. He explained that he thought we might want them for Kendall's baby book so she could see pictures of her dad at her age, and he'd made sure to pick ones that didn't include Diane. The gesture was so thoughtful and careful about our boundaries that I actually got a little teary. The gift bag had a savings bond for Kendall's future and a card that just said he was proud of the parents we'd become. After everyone left and we were cleaning up wrapping paper while Kendall napped, Trevor said his dad had really shown up for us in a way his mom never had. 3 days after the party, the restraining order officially expired. I felt jumpy all day waiting for something to happen, like Diane was going to show up at our door the second the legal protection was gone. But nothing happened that day or the next. Then on the third day, Trevor's phone buzzed with a text from a number we didn't have saved but recognized as Diane's. My heart started racing and I moved closer to Trevor so I could read over his shoulder. The message just said she was happy Kendall had a good birthday, and she hoped Trevor was doing well. That was it. No demands to see Kendall. No guilt trips about being excluded. No manipulation about how much she'd suffered. Trevor stared at his phone for a solid minute before typing back a polite thank you. He didn't add anything else, didn't ask how she was, or invite further conversation. She responded with a simple thumbs-up emoji, and that was the end of it. We both just stood there in our kitchen looking at each other like we couldn't quite believe that interaction had been so normal. A week later, Kylie brought up the idea of a parent support group during one of our regular sessions. She said she ran a group that met twice a month for parents dealing with difficult family dynamics and boundary struggles, and she thought hearing other people's stories might help us feel less alone. Trevor and I talked about it on the drive home and decided to try one meeting to see if it felt right. The first meeting was at a community center near Kylie's office, and there were 8 other parents sitting in a circle when we arrived. Kylie did introductions and explained that everything shared in the group stayed confidential, and then she asked if anyone wanted to start. A woman named Sarah talked about her father, who kept showing up at her kids' school despite being told not to, and a man named Mike shared about his mother, who created fake social media accounts to spy on his family. When it was our turn, Trevor and I took turns explaining the situation with Diane and the restraining order and the baby shower incident. People in the group nodded like they understood exactly what we meant, and afterwards 3 different people came up to say they'd dealt with similar situations. Going to that group every other week became something we actually looked forward to, because it helped to know we weren't the only ones navigating this kind of family mess. We shared strategies that had worked for us, like having Dominic review messages and keeping detailed documentation, and we learned new approaches from other parents who'd been dealing with boundary issues for years. One couple told us about their system for supervised visits that gave us ideas for if we ever decided to let Diane see Kendall. By the time Kendall was 18 months old, our life had settled into a rhythm that felt stable and healthy. Trevor had weekly phone calls with his father that didn't involve any drama or Diane trying to use him as a messenger. His father came over every few weeks to spend time with Kendall, and he'd started teaching her to recognize animals in picture books. Trevor told me one night that his relationship with his dad was better now than it had been in years, because they'd both learned to have boundaries with Diane instead of just managing her chaos. I'd gone back to work part-time and found a daycare we loved where Kendall was thriving and making little toddler friends. Our house felt peaceful in a way it never had during my pregnancy, when I was constantly stressed about Diane's next move. We had date nights again and talked about things other than legal strategies and safety plans. The support group had helped us process a lot of the trauma from that first year, and we both felt stronger as individuals and as a couple. When Trevor's father asked if we'd consider a supervised visit between Diane and Kendall, we didn't immediately say no, like we would have 6 months earlier. He explained that Diane had been in therapy consistently for a full year, and her therapist thought she'd made real progress in understanding why her behavior had been harmful. He showed us his phone with a text thread between him and Diane, where her messages were brief and appropriate. Nothing like the obsessive rambling from before. We told him we needed time to think about it and discuss it with Kylie and Dominic. In our next therapy session, Kylie helped us work through our fears about letting Diane near Kendall, and our hopes that maybe she really had changed enough to have some kind of relationship. We made a list of conditions that would need to be met for us to feel safe, including that the visit had to be at a neutral public location. Trevor's father had to be present the whole time, and it could only last an hour. Dominic reviewed our conditions and said they were reasonable and gave us good protection. We told Trevor's father we'd agree to one visit under those specific terms, and if Diane violated any boundary, there wouldn't be a second chance. The visit happened at a park near Trevor's father's house on a Saturday morning when the weather was nice. We arrived first and picked a picnic table in a visible area where other families were around. Trevor held Kendall on his lap while we waited, and I could feel how tense he was, even though he was trying to act calm. When Diane walked up with Trevor's father, she looked smaller than I remembered, less threatening somehow. She sat down across from us and said hello in a quiet voice, not reaching for Kendall or making demands. For the first few minutes, nobody really knew what to say. Trevor's father asked Kendall if she wanted to see the ducks, and that broke some of the awkwardness. Diane watched Kendall toddle around near the pond and made a few comments about how pretty she was, but she didn't try to pick her up or call herself grandma or anything that would have crossed our boundaries. When Kendall brought a stick back to the table, Diane smiled but waited for Kendall to approach her instead of grabbing at her. The whole visit felt stiff and uncomfortable, but it wasn't the nightmare I'd been afraid of. Diane asked Trevor a couple questions about his job and told me my hair looked nice, just normal small talk that didn't veer into manipulation territory. When the hour was up, we said goodbye, and Diane thanked us for letting her come. She didn't argue when we started to leave or try to negotiate another visit right then. 2 days later, Trevor got a text from Diane that said, "Thank you for the chance to meet Kendall, and she was sorry for how she'd acted before." The message acknowledged that her previous behavior had been wrong and said she was grateful we were willing to give her any opportunity at all. Trevor showed me the text, and we both studied it, looking for hidden manipulation or guilt trips, but it really did seem genuine. He sent back a brief response saying he appreciated her acknowledgement and we'd be in touch. Over the next few months, we did 3 more supervised visits with the same conditions, and Diane managed to behave appropriately at each one. She never tried to hold Kendall without asking, never took photos without permission, never made comments about deserving more time or access. Trevor's father reported that she still went to therapy and had joined a volunteer program at a senior center, finding ways to feel purposeful that didn't involve obsessing over our family. We stayed careful and watchful, ready to shut things down if she started slipping back into old patterns, but she seemed to understand that these visits only continued if she respected our rules. The visits happened every 6 to 8 weeks depending on our schedule, always supervised and always on our terms. One night after Kendall was in bed, Trevor and I sat on our back porch and talked about how different everything was from that terrifying day at the baby shower. We'd gone from me being scared to go to doctor appointments to having a system that actually worked for our family. Trevor said he was proud of how we'd protected Kendall and ourselves while still leaving room for his mom to change if she was willing to do the work. I agreed that we'd gotten something better than a fairy tale ending where everyone forgave each other and pretended nothing bad had happened. Instead, we had a realistic system with clear boundaries and consequences, where Kendall's safety and our peace of mind came first. We didn't have to trust Diane completely or let our guard down, but we also didn't have to cut her off forever if she was willing to respect our family. Kendall was almost 2 years old now, and she was such a happy kid, always laughing and exploring and feeling secure in our love. She had relationships with my parents who visited regularly and spoiled her appropriately, with Trevor's father who read her stories and took her to feed ducks, and with Margot and Julia who were like aunts to her. She had limited supervised contact with Diane, who was learning to be a grandmother within boundaries instead of trying to be a replacement mother. That was what mattered most in the end, that Kendall grew up knowing she was protected and loved, and that her parents would always put her well-being first. About a year and a half after that conversation on the porch, I found out I was pregnant again. We waited until the 12-week mark to tell anyone, and this time we got to share the news on our own terms without anyone finding out early or showing up uninvited. Trevor posted a simple announcement on social media with a picture of Kendall holding a sign that said, "Big Sister," and we waited to see how people would respond. My parents called right away to congratulate us and ask how I was feeling. Julia sent a bunch of excited texts with heart emojis. Trevor's father called that evening to say he was thrilled and asked if we needed anything. And Diane sent a text the next morning that just said, "Congratulations on your growing family," which was exactly the kind of response we'd hoped for. No demands for information about the gender, no plans for taking over, no mentions of what she deserved or was owed. Just a normal grandmother response that respected our boundaries. Trevor showed me the text, and we both felt this huge sense of relief that we didn't have to brace for drama or manipulation this time around. The rest of the pregnancy was so different from the first one that it almost felt surreal. I went to every appointment without looking over my shoulder or worrying that Diane would show up. I joined pregnancy groups online under my real name without fear that she was lurking in them pretending to be pregnant herself. We picked out baby stuff and decorated the nursery without anyone trying to claim ownership of our decisions. Trevor came to every ultrasound, and we found out together that we were having another girl, and his only reaction was pure joy, without any worry about how his mother would respond. We told our families about the gender through a simple group text, and Diane replied with a short message saying she was happy for us. No meltdown about it not being a boy. No conspiracy theories. Just appropriate grandparent behavior. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop and for Diane to start inserting herself or making demands, but it never happened. She stuck to the boundaries we'd established and only reached out occasionally with brief check-ins that Trevor would respond to politely. The peaceful pregnancy gave me space to actually enjoy being pregnant instead of spending all my energy on anxiety and protection mode. I could focus on Kendall and preparing her to be a big sister. Trevor and I took a childbirth refresher class and talked about how we wanted things to go differently this time with visitors and announcements. We made plans for Kendall to stay with my parents when I went into labor so she wouldn't be scared or confused. Everything felt manageable and calm in a way that the first pregnancy never got to be. Trevor was so much more present and engaged without the constant weight of his mother's expectations hanging over him. He wasn't torn between protecting me and appeasing Diane anymore. He could just be excited about becoming a dad again without guilt or conflict. We talked about baby names without anyone trying to claim naming rights. We planned the nursery layout without anyone insisting they knew better. We made decisions together as partners and parents without outside interference. When I went into labor with our second daughter, Sophia, we followed our plan, and my parents picked up Kendall before we headed to the hospital. The birth went smoothly, and Sophia arrived healthy after just 8 hours of labor. We spent the first day in the hospital as just our family of 4, taking pictures and videos and letting Kendall meet her baby sister. On the second day, we posted a simple birth announcement with Sophia's name, weight, and length, along with a photo of the girls together. The responses came in quickly from family and friends. My parents visited that afternoon and brought Kendall to see us again. Trevor's father came by that evening with a gift basket and spent an hour holding Sophia and reading to Kendall. And Diane sent a text saying congratulations on Sophia's arrival, followed by a message saying she'd sent a gift card to our email. That was it. No demands to visit. No attempts to show up at the hospital. No claims about her rights or what she deserved. Just appropriate responses that respected the boundaries we'd worked so hard to establish. When we brought Sophia home, Trevor's father asked if he could visit the following weekend, and we said yes because he'd proven over and over that he understood and respected our rules. He came over on Saturday afternoon, held Sophia gently, played with Kendall, and left after a couple hours without overstaying or pushing for more access. Life settled into a new normal with 2 kids under 3. Kendall adjusted to being a big sister with some typical toddler jealousy, but mostly excitement about helping with the baby. Trevor and I figured out how to manage 2 different sleep schedules and twice as many diapers and all the chaos that comes with adding another child. And through it all, the boundaries we'd established with Diane held. She didn't try to push for more contact or guilt trip us about keeping her away from the girls. She sent appropriate birthday cards and holiday gifts. She responded to the occasional photos Trevor sent with brief thank you messages. There were still moments of tension when she'd send a text that felt slightly off, or when we'd hear through Trevor's father that she'd said something about wishing she could see the girls more. But those moments were manageable because we had systems in place, and we knew how to shut things down if needed. We didn't have a perfect fairy tale family where everyone got along and all past hurts were forgotten. We had something more realistic and sustainable. A family structure with clear boundaries and consequences where everyone knew the rules. Kendall and Sophia were growing up in a home where their parents protected them first and modeled what healthy relationships looked like. They had grandparents who loved them appropriately and respected their parents' authority. They had stability and security, even if the extended family dynamics weren't always smooth. And that was enough. That was actually better than pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. We'd done the hard work of establishing boundaries and sticking to them even when it was painful and difficult. We'd protected our family without completely cutting off the possibility of limited contact if Diane continued to respect our rules. And we'd built a life that worked for us, even if it didn't look like what other families had. That was the real victory. Not some dramatic reconciliation or perfect ending, but a functional, imperfect family system where our kids could grow up safe and loved.